Hello. Thanks for joining this Dynamics User Group webinar hosted by MS Dynamics World. Today we're going to be talking about Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations Security and Licensing Overview. Quick introduction about myself. My name is Alex Meyer. I work as a senior manager in business application solutions for a company called Protiviti. We do business consulting across a number of different areas in the business. My contact information is listed there in the middle. A little background about myself. I do have a Microsoft MVP award in business applications based on work that I've done in my blog, my book that I've written, and other things in the community. I've worked with AX since 2013 and F&O since 2016. And I've spoken at a number of different conferences around the United States and in Europe, focusing on security, audit, licensing, and best practices and native controls in those areas. A quick agenda about the webinar today, what we're going to be covering. We're going to look at the role-based security architecture that exists within D365F&O. We're going to break that down a little bit further into security layers and the secureable objects that exist in the system. And then we're going to look at the hierarchy of the security layers and how those build on top of each other. We're going to look at how you can set up security from the user interface and the AOT, or the backend or code side. And then we're going to look at the user role assignments and how that setup occurs. And then after we get through all of the security side, we're going to look at the licensing portion of this and how security and licensing are tied together. And then we're going to look at tools and other resources that are available to help with your security and licensing in your organization. So let's go ahead and get started. First, we're going to look at the security model that exists within Dynamics 365 F&O. So when we talk about the security model, it's going to be a role-based security, which means that users in your system are going to be assigned one or more roles that exist within your environment. This is a pessimistic security model, meaning that a user has no access in your environment unless you actually grant that access. And like we already kind of mentioned, it's a hierarchy-based security model, which means that there are different security layers that build on top of each other. And then when you're assigned a particular role within the system, you get all of the different access underneath that role based on that hierarchy. So there's really two main categories of objects that exist that define what a role has access to. And those are going to be the security layers that we've talked about, and then the secureable objects underneath those. So let's take a look at these each in a little bit deeper dive. If we start with security layers, there's really three different layers that exist within D365 itself. At the top, we have the roles, which we already mentioned. Those are actually going to be what are assigned to users within your environment. It's the only thing that can be assigned to a user. And this is going to be your broadest security layer. Normally, these are going to represent a job function that a user would perform, such as an accountant, accounts payable, things like that. And those are going to be made up of any number of sub roles where you assign roles to other roles, or duties or privileges, right? So you can assign all of those different objects to roles within your environment. At the next layer down, you're going to have duties. These are your middle security layer. They're going to represent a general task that a user would perform, things like approving customer invoices, maintaining a budget plan, things like that. And those are going to be made up of any number of duty or privileges, right? So a privilege is the only thing that can be assigned to a duty within D365F&O. And then at the bottom, you have your privileges. So the privileges are going to be your most granular security layer, and this is where the majority of your object assignment is going to occur. So this is where you start to get into very specific processes or tasks that a user would perform, things like adding a BOM line, adding in a customer, things like that. So those are the different security layers. Now, if we look at the secureable objects that exist, the objects are broken up into different types as well, just like the security layers were. So your secureable objects, the first one that we talk about is probably one that you're most familiar with. These are going to be menu items that exist within the system itself. And those menu items are broken into three different subcategories underneath those. The first being menu item displays, which are linked to forms within finance and operations. So anytime a user goes to a form within the application itself, the security for that form or the base form is actually linked to the menu item display. So if you have read access to the menu item display, you would have read access to that form itself, etc. The second menu item type is outputs. So anytime you are in the user interface and you click on a button and it actually generates a report, those are controlled by menu item outputs, the access to those. And then the final menu item type are menu item actions. So anytime there's an action that's being performed, so if you click something or navigate to a page and it actually runs a process in the back end, normally those are controlled by menu item actions. So things like posting a purchase order or journal entry, cutting a check, like things like that are menu item actions that are occurring within the system. So those are the three different menu item types when you are looking at those. The second securable object type that we see is going to be tables. So you can actually go in this, and these would be considered data sources on those forms that we talked about for the menu items. And those are actually going to refer to SQL tables. And this is where the data is actually being stored within your environment. So if you have read access to the SQL table, right, you have read access to the underlying data for those. And then the next secureable object type would be data entities. So these are a somewhat new concept within F&O. And what they do is they combine multiple different SQL tables to encapsulate a business concept. Really what that means is that a lot of the data within D365 F&O is normalized. So it's going to exist across a number of different tables within the system. And so data entities really join those tables back together to allow the end user to more easily work with these different ideas or topics in the system. So things like purchase orders or users, right? Those actually exist across a number of different tables behind the scenes. And so to make it easier for an end user to actually interact with these, we have these data entities that allow you to interact with purchase orders or users, right, without having to understand the structure of those the tables behind the scenes. So these data entities are what normally like an external user or an external application would use to interact with F&O itself, right? So they allow for CRUD operations, so create, read, update, and delete from externally from F&O, and they don't require X++ knowledge to utilize or consume, but they do require knowledge on which data entity to use for a specific process that you're trying to perform. And then the last secureable object type are service operations. And these are really going to be your externally facing API endpoints. So if you, again, are looking externally and wanting to connect to F&O, right, you could either use a data entity, or if there's additional business logic that you want to perform that you can't really do with a data entity, right, that would be where a service operation comes in. And so these do require X++ knowledge, because you're actually creating the endpoint and then telling the system what to do when that endpoint is called. So now that we know the security layers and secureable objects, right, we can start looking at what's the hierarchy-based security model actually look like, right? So again, we have these ideas of your role-based security model where you have roles at the very top. Those are going to be assigned to users. You have your duties underneath, your privileges underneath those, and your privileges are where your object assignment is occurring. And so that's how the hierarchy would be in a perfect world, right, from a Microsoft perspective, that they would want you to use it. But you'll notice here that we've already kind of talked about different ways that you can kind of circumvent that, right? Where you can assign roles to other roles. You can assign privileges directly to roles, right? You can assign table level access to roles. And so there are different ways that you break that hierarchy, but in looking at it from a holistic perspective, right? You can think of your roles at the very top, your duties underneath that, the privileges underneath them, and then the object assignment occurring underneath that. So looking at from the role setup side, right, how do we actually assign these roles to users? And so first and foremost, there are template or out-of-the-box roles that are duties and privileges that are delivered out of the box from Microsoft, right? So those roles and duties and privileges are delivered just as part of the system implementation. There's nothing you have to do to get those. And then those roles, duties, and privileges are system-wide. So, and that's the same for the out of the box plus the custom. And so what that means is that anything that any roles, duties, or privileges that you have are not based on a per company or per legal entity instance, right? If you have an accountant role, that's going to be the same access, whether it's in company A or company B, company C, etc. And then the way that you actually then can control which legal entities or companies a user has access to is then once you assign a role to a user, you can then restrict that access to a specific legal entity at that point. So the role itself is not restricted to a legal entity, but once you assign it to a user, then that role can be restricted to a legal entity from there. So by default, when you assign a role to a user, one thing to keep in mind is that that user gets that role across all legal entities or companies in the environment. So if you just assign a role to a user and don't do anything else, that user has access to every legal entity in your environment with the access that that role has. And so once you assign that role to a user, then, right, like we mentioned, you can then go and actually restrict that to a single legal entity or multiple legal entities. You can use things like organizational hierarchies to help do that restriction as well. And so once a legal entity or company is assigned to a user, that user only has that access in that legal entity going forward, right? And so as long as there's at least one legal entity or company assigned to a user role assignment, that user is restricted to those. And so the tables that actually control that, if you go and want to look on the SQL side for this, are the security user role table. That's going to actually control your user to role assignment. And then the OM user role organization and security user role condition tables are actually, we would do that legal entity or company restriction from that. All right, so we've done a lot of talking about the theoretical side. How do we actually go in and set up security right from the user interface and from the AOT? So when we start to look at setting up security from the user interface, right, we can start there and then we'll compare and contrast that to setting it up in the AOT. So if we set it up from the user interface, this can be found in the system administration, security configuration area. When you launch that form, you're going to see something very similar to what you see here in the middle. And I know there's a lot of different colored boxes here, and I've kind of tried to break this down into the different areas that you would see. So first and foremost, in the upper left-hand corner, you have your roles, duties, and privileges in that green box there. Those are actually going to designate which security layer you're looking at. So the way that the system works is that you can first filter the list by roles, duties, or privileges. And then in the red box underneath there is where you would actually see those roles, duties, or privileges being listed, right? So if you select roles, right, it's going to show you all the roles in the system. You select duties, it's going to show you the duties, etc. Once you actually select an individual object or security layer from that list, so for example, we selected the accountant role in this case, the pink box in the right-hand side there is actually going to show you the description of that particular security layer. If there is an AOT name or a programmatic name for that particular security layer, you would see that in the next box down in that AOT name. And then if there's any XDS or extensible data security applied to that, you would actually see it in that security policy context string in the third box there. Underneath that pink box is a purple box, which actually shows you all the references. So in this case, the accountant role, right? Anytime you see a plus button or a plus sign next to a particular entry here, that means that there's an assignment or reference that's occurring at that level. So in this case, the accountant role, we can see that there are duties that are assigned to this particular role. There are privileges assigned to this role, and there are tables assigned to this role, right? So we can see that based on the plus icon that's there as well. Also, when you select a row, if we move our way back up to the top here, we can see there's a blue box that actually is going to show you what it's an action bar that's going to show you what actions you can perform based on the selection that you made. So in this case, you know, obviously we can always create a new security role that's available there. The undo and redo buttons are grayed out because no changes have been made to this role to either undo or redo. The show all levels will actually show you all of the expanded levels if you actually go out to every time you do a click in the main area here, you'll have a fly out to the right. By default, Microsoft will shrink that down to only show a few of those layers and kind of give you breadcrumbs of that. If you actually want to show the entire hierarchy, you can go show all layers and it'll show that. And then you can do things like deleting a particular security layer. You can duplicate or copy a security layer as well. And then the last two are actually different processes you can perform. So the view permissions is going to give you an overview to say what access does the highlighted security layer have. So in this case, it would show you all of the access down to the object level that account role has. So it would show you the role to subrole, the duty to privilege to object to access, and then the license as well. So the view permissions report for that particular security layer is very powerful. And then the last option there in that audit trail will actually show you the history of that particular security layer and any time that it's been modified. So if you go in and make a change and you to a security layer and you want to go back and actually see, the changes that have been made, or if you want to, see what actually has been done to the security layer, you can use that audit trail functionality there. The final piece that we haven't talked about yet is that light blue, the unpublished object area at the top. That unpublished objects area is kind of a holding area for any changes you do make via the user interface to security. So your changes to security don't go live immediately. You actually have to go to that area and publish those changes. So it's kind of that holding area to say, here's all the changes you've made, and you can publish those out from there. So when we're looking at object access in the user interface, again, most of that object access is going to occur at that privilege, at the privilege level. And so what you would do then is find the privilege that you want to modify or look at. You would then go and, again, in that next flyout area, you would find the different objects that are assigned. In this case, the accept request for quotation, it has assigned, in this case, it has menu item displays assigned to it. We can then see in the next area over all of the different menu items that are assigned to this privilege, the perch rec, those 4 different menu items there. And then in the far right side, then we can actually see the access that the particular object is assigned, right? The read, update, create, and delete permissions that exist here. And so if you've used AX 2012 in the past, right, this may look slightly different because at the object level in AX 2012, right, you would only assign read, update, create, and delete, and you didn't have this unset, grant, deny, right? You would just set the access type. And so one of the new things within F&O is this idea of being able to explicitly deny a particular security layer. And so that's what that deny is there for. So you can kind of think of these as your grant is the same grant that you had in AX 2012, right? I want to grant read access to an object. The deny is an explicit deny again, so that's going to override any other grants that you have. So if you want to ensure that a user does not have access to a particular object, you can use that deny functionality. And then your unset is just the default state, right? It's not granting access, it's not denying access, it's just there to be a placeholder until you either want to grant or deny access to that object. All right, so we kind of talked about that unpublished objects area, right? And again, this is that area where all of your security changes that you do make are going to go until you actually want to publish those changes out. So this is the area to review those changes before you actually publish them out. So when we talk about this, right, one of the big differences you're going to see from the user interface and from the AOT when you're talking about security is really where are these security changes actually stored? And so when you actually go and publish changes from that unpublished object area in the user interface, what's going to happen is that the data for that particular security layer or the changes that you made or the new security layers that you've created are actually going to be stored as data in the database. And so I have an example here of going in and actually modifying the accountant and the accounting manager role in this case, which are out of the box roles from Microsoft. I went in and made a change and then published those changes. And so what actually is going to happen then is that there's an entire entry and then the XML for that, which is the access that particular role has. So that's stored as data in the database. And so this starts to come into play when you are starting to make decisions on where you want to make changes to security, because when we get to the AOT side, you'll notice that there's how that data is stored or how the security data is stored is going to be different than the user interface, right? So security done in the AOT is going to be stored as code, whereas security done in the user interface is going to be stored as data. So then the question is, well, how do I maintain this? How do I, actually move this data from environment to environment? And so that's where some of these next slides come into play. So we were just talking about how you want to actually migrate security, what processes actually exist for that. And so one of the options you have is within that security configuration area, there's in the upper action bar again, there's a data tab. If you click on that data tab, you'll see that there's an import and export functionality here. This import and export functionality, what it actually does is it goes out and looks to see all the changes you made in the user interface. And if you export those changes, it'll export every security change to a very large XML file that you can then take to another environment and import those changes there. So if you've made changes in your development environment and you want to then take that to another environment, you can export the changes from your development environment and then import those changes somewhere else. So that's the manual method of performing those changes. If you actually were moving from a development environment to UAT or another tier, right, and moving up the chain, the best recommendation would be to treat these changes like you would code. So you'd actually export those changes from like a development environment, actually check in that security XML to your source control, and then use that going forward to promote to the next tier in your the chain, right? So making sure that you're treating your security like you would code helps with kind of getting the right mindset when you're looking at the migration process and what that looks like. So we've looked at this from the user interface perspective, right? So let's go ahead and look at this from the AOT side. So we're talking about setting up security from the AOT or from the programmatic side. One of the first questions is, well, how do I actually access a development environment? And you can really go about it one of two ways. You can either have a cloud hosted environment, which is where you deploy it via LCS and you access that environment by RDPing or remote desktoping to it, or you can have a local virtual machine for this, where you deploy a virtual machine via VHD provided again via LCS. In each case, these development environments both going to be a tier 1 environment that is an all-in-one box, and it's going to have a modified version of Visual Studio that it has an additional extension in it that has all of the Dynamics 365 functionality that you would need. So when we start talking about the AOT or application object tree, really all that is just an overview or a way to look at all of the objects that exist within your environment. If you've dealt with AX 2012 in the past, right, this is going to look very, very familiar in that they had a very similar way to display this. But you can actually access the AOT by going to View and then Application Explorer, which will bring up then an Explorer that shows all these different objects. And you can notice here that there's actually a security subheading. So all of your roles, duties, and privileges, right, would be listed in those separate areas in your environment. If we actually want to go and create a role, duty, or privilege, right, the first thing we would do is actually create an X++ project. X++ is the development language that Dynamics 365 uses. And that X++ project, then we can go ahead and create new items in here. And these items or objects, right, are the different code and forms and other things that we can add. But one of the things here that we can actually look at is creating custom security. So you can see under the finance and operations, Dynamics 365 items, there's a security heading. You're going to notice that you have roles, duties, and privileges listed here, right? So you can create new roles, duties, and privileges. You also have security policies, which are XDS or extensible data security policies that you can create. But what you would do is select either role, duty, or privilege, right? Depending on which security layer you'd like to create, you would give that security layer a name. In this case, it's Protiviti test role. So we're going to create a new role and call it Protiviti test role, right? And once we create that, then you'll notice that that object, the new role is created, and you can see the different subheadings or sub objects that we can then assign to that role, the privileges, sub roles, duties, and table permissions here. So if we actually want to then go and associate a duty to a role, what we would do is open up that duties menu, you right click on it and go to new duty. In this case, we're not actually creating a new duty and assigning it to that role. What we're actually doing is creating a new duty association for that role. So we're actually going to assign one of the out-of-the-box roles from Microsoft, the customer master inquiry duty, and assign it to the Protiviti test role that we just created. You'll notice when we're dealing on in the AOT or programmatic side, all of the different security layers, we're going to reference those by the programmatic or system name. So all of these are going to have also a label that is generated that's going to be shown in the user interface or front end. But when we're actually creating our roles, duties, and privileges, right, all of the different associations and all of the ways that we're referencing these security layers are going to be done via their system name. If we look at setting up object access or creating or assigning objects to a privilege in this case, right, the setup is similar to what we looked at from associating a duty to a role, but it's going to be slightly different. So in this case, we've created a Protiviti test privilege, right? And now we can actually go in and see the different objects we can assign to that privilege. So if we wanted to, for example, assign this menu item display to this privilege, we would go under entry points. We would create a new entry point reference. And then we can go ahead and set up and provide the information about the object type, the name that we're going to, of the object we want to assign, in this case, the cust table list page, which is the main page, the view where you can view all of your customers at. And then we can assign an access level to that as well, right? So we're going to assign, in this case, read access to the cust table list page. So now our Protiviti test privilege has read access to that object. And one of the things you're going to notice is if you are coming again from AX 2012 to F&O, one of the big differences from a strictly code perspective is this idea that you no longer can do any overlayering, right? It's all done via extensions. And so for those that may not know, overlayering is this idea where you can actually modify the code provided to you by Microsoft or another third party or ISV. And actually overlay or create a new customization on top of the code that's delivered. That's no longer allowed in Dynamics 365 F&O. And so the way that you can go in and actually create customizations on top of out of the box or delivered code is by creating an extension, which is just like the name implies, extending the functionality of that. And so if you actually want to go in and modify out of the box roles, duties, or privileges from Microsoft via code, you can do that. You just have to go in and actually create an extension of that particular security layer. In this case, we're making a customization or extension to the audit policy manager role. And so that's the process that you would use to actually do that. And just like we had the unpublished object area in the user interface, right? We do have to do a similar process when we're creating the security via the AOT. And that's by actually going in and synchronizing the project. So what you would actually do with the process, right, is you would go into your project, you would create your roles and user privileges or your modifications. You would then build the project to make sure that everything is set up correctly from a syntax perspective. And then you would actually synchronize that project with the database to actually make that security go live. So you'll notice if you right click on the project within Visual Studio, one of the options you'll have there is synchronize your project with the database. So that's the process you would have to execute after you actually build the project for your security to become live. And so then the follow-up question is, okay, well, we talked about where the security changes are stored in the user interface, right? How is that different in the AOT? So if you create your security in code, Microsoft is actually going to treat that as a development artifact, which is just a fancy way of saying that they're going to treat your security changes the same way that they would treat code. So anytime you create a custom role, duty, or privilege, or create an extension, that the actual setup or configuration of that role, duty, or privilege is going to be stored as an XML document that actually stores all the different associations and object access that you've assigned in that document itself. And so the process for actually, checking those changes in or keeping track of those changes becomes much easier because you can treat your security files just like you would your code files or customizations. You can check those under source control. They can then be monitored and have an audit log of any changes that occur. And then you can use, Azure DevOps, whatever process you're going to use from a build pipeline perspective, to actually push those changes to other environments. And so that kind of leads into how do you migrate security, right? And so we'd really want to follow that application lifecycle management process, or ALM process, you have for your code changes or your other customizations that you have, right? Going to a build server and then going to whatever, dispersing to other environments, just like you would your customizations there. And so that's really the process that you would see migrating your security, whether it's going to another environment at the same tier or going and promoting it to other tiers as well. So let's go ahead and switch gears slightly and talk about user licensing, right? We've talked about setting up security in the user interface in the AOT or programmatic side, right? Now let's go ahead and talk about how that's setting up that security is going to impact our licensing. And so the first question is, how are these two things tied together, right? How is my security impacting my licensing within D365F&O? And that really brings up a unique point about D365, and then the fact that your licensing is based on what a user is assigned, not what a user consumes or utilizes. And that's different than a lot of other systems in this space, right? And so you can very easily see that if you have a user that's over provisioned from an access perspective, right, they may be over provisioned as well from a licensing perspective on what they actually need based on their day-to-day operations, but they're over assigned. Access is actually driving their license consumption up to another level. And so what we're going to do is look at how licensing actually is determined, and then what we can actually do to maybe reduce that license requirement and the steps we would take there. So first and foremost, let's take an overview of what the licensing methodologies look like, and then we can kind of go from there. So first off, there's 3 different license types that exist within D365F&O. You have your operations at the top. That is going to be actually broken down into subcategories of finance, supply chain management, retail, and talent. And we'll get into how that happens here in the next couple of slides. But that's your operations layer is at the top level. That's going to be your most expensive license. Underneath that, you have activity. And then at the very bottom, you have team member, right? So each of these have a different price point that they're at. And so if you can get your user to only require an activity license rather than an operations license, right, you're saving that cost every month from a overall cost perspective for your environment itself. There's really 2 different licensing methodologies currently that Microsoft uses. There's entry point based licensing and privilege based licensing, and we're going to go into in depth on what each of those mean and how those are actually analyzed and configured. So if we want to look at the licensing model from a diagram perspective, right, this is what it looked like pre-October 2019. So if you had a licensing guide from pre-October 2019, this is what it would look like. So you'll notice here that you have this idea that they had different plans that you could purchase, and you had this Dynamics 365 plan that gave you access to both the customer engagement, which was your CRM, your what is now sales and customer service, right, side of things, as well as your unified operations plan, which was your finance and operations, talent, retail side, right? You could purchase one plan and get access to both of those. And you could also just buy a customer engagement plan or a unified ops plan, right? If you just wanted access to either side of those, if you wanted the CRM or the F&O side, right? Then you could still go and buy the different applications as well. But really, it gave you this idea where you could buy a plan and have access to a large chunk of functionality from Microsoft. If you look at post-October 2019, right, the licensing model changes. You'll notice that the plans go away, where you could purchase all of customer engagement or all of F&O or even both. And now you have your different applications are standalone licenses. And so you can see here that you have, a finance license or SCM license or a retail license, right, that you can purchase, and then you would have to, on the unified operations side, but then you could also go back to the customer engagement side, right, if you needed access to that as well. But it's kind of they've broken up the different applications apart a little bit more, and you have to pick and choose the different licensing areas that you actually need. So if we look at the actual methodologies themselves, right, the first type that we see is an entry point based licensing. And if you've dealt with, again, going back to AX 2012, if you've done licensing there, this is going to look very familiar. This is going to be based on the access to entry points that a user has. And when we talk about entry points, we're really just talking about menu items, right? Menu items, displays, outputs, and actions. Each menu item is going to have two separate parameters. There's going to be a maintain user license and a view user license parameter. So if a user has create, update, or delete permission to this particular menu item, right, whatever license is in the maintain user license is going to be required. But if a user only has read access, whatever license is in the view user license parameter is going to be required. So if we take a look at the example we have here, the sys user info detail menu item, right, if I assign this to a particular role, duty, or privilege, and I assign it at a read level, this object is only going to require a universal license, which is a team member license in F&O. But if I assign this at a create, update, or delete level to a role, duty, or privilege, right, then it's going to require an enterprise license, which is an operations level license, right, which is the highest. And so you can see very quickly, right, that if I, giving access at that higher level is going to require a much higher license and have a much higher incurred cost for this particular menu item itself. And so what happens is that this, as if you look at it from a user license perspective, right, the system will go through and analyze all of the different menu items that a user has, and it'll look to see what's the highest license requirement that user needs based on their access to each individual menu item. And it only takes one access at a higher license level for that user to require that higher level license. So if you have 1,000 accesses coming across, that the user's assigned and only one of them is requiring an enterprise level license, right, that user itself is going to require an enterprise level license. And so that's something to keep in mind going through here. And one of the things that Microsoft loves to do is change how they actually license their products. And so one of the new changes that recently came out in 10.0.34 is a new feature flag called Disable Read Grant Team Member License, which is a kind of a hidden feature flag that is enabled for every customer unless you go in and actually disable it manually. And it's going to, what it does is it basically takes all of the read access to all of the menu items and forces them to be a team member license. So regardless of what you have set at the view user license parameter for those different objects, if you're assigning read access to those and you have this feature turned on by default, again, remember, right, then that access is only going to require a team member license regardless of what is in the view user license parameter. So that's one of a big change for this, and I have an entire blog post on this that you can go and look at too if you want to take a deeper dive into it. All right, so we talked about entry point based licensing, right? Let's go ahead and switch gears to the privilege based side, right? So this is really where the entry point based licensing is going to categorize the license requirement into that operations activity or team member. This is privilege based licensing is only going to apply to users that require that operations level license, and it's going to break down that operations level license into the different license SKUs that they could potentially be assigned. So that finance, supply chain management, retail, project operations, right? And so what this does is going to look at the privileges that user is assigned and determine which license is required, which license or licenses is required based on those privileges. And so really the way that this works is that there is a table that Microsoft populates called the Licensing Service Plans Privilege Table that has an association between the privilege and the different license SKUs. So if a user is assigned a particular privilege, right, that Microsoft has designated as requiring a license, right, this is where they would actually have that association to that. So you can see in this case, right, all of the privileges listed. If a user is assigned one of those, right, they would require a finance license based on the example we have here. just to add one more wrinkle into this entire process too, is you'll notice that there is unique column on the very right there. That is unique column is telling the system whether that a user assigned to that privilege is required to have that license, or if that license is one of the licenses that could be assigned to the user. So if we look at the account entity view privilege, for example, that is required to have a finance license. So that user must be assigned a finance license based on the fact that they're assigned to that particular privilege. But if we are looking at, for example, the abbreviations entity maintain privilege on the first row there, right, that is unique of 0, which means that a finance license is one of the possible licenses that user could be assigned to meet the requirement. And so when we start looking through all these different privileges and the licenses right there, the question becomes, okay, well, what happens if my user is requiring to have multiple licenses? And so this is where you have this idea of a base and an attached license scenario. So the way that Microsoft looks at this is that there's going to be one license that you're going to consider to be your quote unquote base that comes at a particular price point, and then you can have additional attached licenses to that base license at a much reduced cost, based on the requirements for that particular user. And so Microsoft, again, has a nice matrix here that's available in their licensing guide that basically goes through and says, okay, here are the different base licenses you can have, and here are the different other licenses you can attach to that license. And so, if you have a situation where you have a base license assigned to the user and then you need additional licenses and you can attach those licenses, right? That's going to give, reduce the overall cost of that user instead of having all of these be separate base licenses. And so if there's a dot in the matrix, right, as you work your way across here, looking at the different base licenses here, if there's a dot in that, that cell, right, that means that you can attach that license to that base license. All right, so I put together, based on everything we've looked at, right, the entry point based licensing, the privilege based licensing, the different call outs that we had from, the changes that have occurred recently. I try to keep an updated kind of decision tree and a Visio diagram here to show the process that Microsoft is actually going through when they're looking at the licenses and doing that analysis. And so this Visio diagram kind of goes through the different decisions that are made and how they actually determine what a user is required to have from a license perspective. And so you can absolutely get a higher quality version of this or a higher definition version of this on my blog post or in the PowerPoint that the presentation has afterwards. All right, let's go ahead and talk about license reporting. So which reporting options exist for users, right? If we're going in and trying to figure out, okay, which licenses are required for a particular user role due to your privilege. So the first place we're going to go is we're going to look at that view permissions report that we looked at earlier. One of the key points of this report is all the way on the right-hand side is going to be the different licenses that are required for each entry or each object that's assigned to this particular role in this case, right? So you can run this report for any role due to your privilege in the system. And then for each object access for that, it'll actually have the license that's required for it. One of the interesting parts here is that if you see, for example, the license SKU being showed here, which is your finance, supply chain management, retail, project operations, enterprise asset management, right? Those types of license SKUs that Microsoft has, those are actually referencing the privilege, right? So that privilege is actually causing that particular license. If you see team member activity or operations, right, that's your entry point based licensing, and that's based on the object itself. Right. And so it's kind of, this report can sometimes be a little bit confusing to read, but as long as you keep in mind that it may be referencing, that license may be referencing different things based on the license that's shown, that can make it a little bit easier. In the upper left-hand corner is going to be the license requirement overall for this particular role due to your privilege. So in this case, I know very quickly that if I were to assign the account role to a user, that user is going to require a finance license based on the access this account role has. You can also, when you're assigning the roles to a user, so if you go to the user screen, you actually go into assign another role to a user, the flyout window that shows up here is going to have the license requirement for the particular role that you're assigning to the user, so you know beforehand what that potentially might do to that user from the licensing perspective. You also have the ability then to go in and run license reports at the user level. This is going to be in your system administration inquiries and then license area. So you have your user license counts and user license counts history. Those reports are very, very similar. It's just that the history report allows you to go back in time if you have the batch job running that actually populates this report. But what happens is that once this report is executed, right, it'll actually go out and look at all of the roles assigned to each user and determine the license requirements for that role, and then look to see, okay, what's the highest level license requirement for those users, and then group those together. So in this case, we're looking at, we have 63 operations level users. And you can see that broken down by each user, the roles that they're assigned and the license requirement for those. One thing you'll notice is that these reports, the user license counts and the history report, are only going to look at your entry point based licensing. They're not going to look at your privilege based license SKUs in this case. The only report that will actually show the license SKUs is your user license estimator report, which again is under your system administration inquiries and then license reports area. This report is actually going to go out and look specifically at your users that are requiring that operations level license, and will require the license SKUs for that user. One thing to keep in mind is that if you have a user that requires an operations level license but doesn't have an is unique value of any of their privileges that are assigned marked as true, that means that any base license can be applied to that user. They will not show up in this report because this is only going to show users that are actually required to have a license because that is unique value. So there may be users that still require a base license of some kind that don't show up in this report. All right, so we've looked at the licensing side, and the different methodologies and analyses that are actually being performed at a user role, duty, and privilege level. What tools and services are available to help, right? If you don't want to try to take this on yourself and you're looking for help for this, right? What exists out there for you. And so there are absolutely going to be free resources. I have blogs. There's other Microsoft MVPs that also have blogs on these topics as well. I would absolutely make sure that you are utilizing the free resources as well. This section right here is going to be specifically on other paid options that you have and other ISVs and other professional services that you could get. So there's our ISVs for that you can use to actually help generate some of these reports. FastPath and XPlus are both options there. And then if you want any professional services, right, you could look at Protiviti and does have services to help with that as well. But like I did mention, there are free resources here at the end of this slide deck. I have a number of different resources on my blog. All of these are different resources that I've put out or blog posts that I have, right? That are absolutely free for you to use. Be sure to utilize those if you do have questions there. Or you can also reach out to me as well. Happy to answer any questions regardless of if it's for professional services or not. If you just want to talk about security and licensing, I obviously love to do that. So feel free to reach out. I'm happy to do that. Links to my blog. I do have a F&O security course if you'd like that, an on-demand course online. I have a book on Amazon on this topic as well. A number of different ways to contact me. Feel free to reach out. Happy to do that. And one final thing, I did want to thank again Dynamics user groups for allowing me to present today. I want to thank MS Dynamics World for hosting this webinar, and want to make sure that we are taking advantage of those free resources. And speaking of that, there's a number of great resources on Dynamics user groups, right? There's forums, you can ask questions there as well. And then there's also conferences coming up that DynamicsCon hosts, both a live version, which is going to be in Denver in May. Feel free to go ahead and sign up for that. And they have a virtual conference as well later this year in November. Absolutely make sure you take advantage of those. It's always great to get and network with other end users and partners and ISVs and to really be around the community and being able to talk through that. So again, make sure you guys are being connected. Make sure you're being a part of the community. If you have questions about anything we covered today, happy to answer those. Thanks again for taking time out, and looking forward to connecting with you guys in the future. Thank you.